recent rather strident comments by the chairman of the ABC about Joe Rogan and his podcast interviews in America make you wonder whether he is another prime example of a disconnected elite. Is Kim Williams unaware of what normal citizens are seeking, of the shortcomings of the organisation, the ABC, publicly funded broadcaster in Australia, that he oversees? And indeed, is he unaware of what alternatives to the establishment media really entail and how widespread they actually are? Did he accidentally mistake Rogan for Andrew Tate or someone else he's heard of secondhand, as he decried, quote, people like Mr. Rogan, unquote, whose actions in the media space he finds, quote, deeply repulsive, close quotes. The most anticipated interview of the United States election was Donald Trump sitting down with Joe Rogan for a long 3-hour chat about the state of America. It wasn't CNN, it wasn't Fox, but a former comedian and TV show host who talks to retired professional fighters, social media commentators, contrarian scientists about anything ranging from the perfect grappling technique to whether dragons ever existed to how safe and effective the COVID-19 vaccinations were. Amidst this variety, Rogan earnestly addresses serious questions of policy and culture at a level unseen now in the mainstream media, or as it's known, the MSM. Perhaps more importantly, he encourages the sifting of a range of views on contentious topics so that his viewers can then make up their own minds. They're not told what to think. They're given information, they can form their own views. I can't help observing just how different things might be if the ABC were to similarly appreciate viewpoint diversity. The Trump-Rogan interview got nearly 40 million views on YouTube alone in its first 3 days. There can be little doubt that it contributed to Trump's convincing win, for he was not preaching only to the converted on Rogan's show. This is important to note. Rogan has 65 million subscribers across multiple platforms, 80% of them male. Research suggests that his audience is young, averaging between 18 and 34 years. How many people in that demographic plug into the ABC? Why have they lost them? Why are there no hard questions, no reflection going on about these matters? Because people are plainly voting with their listening ears to move away from mainstream media. Most importantly for Trump, 32% of Rogan's listeners identify as Republican, 27% identify as Democrat, and the rest are undecided or independent. Ours is the age of the podcast. In Australia, men and women have different podcast habits. Unlike in America, where a slim majority of podcast listeners are male, the majority of listeners in Australia, surprisingly, 60% are female, according to research carried out by Podcast Services Australia. But the preferred genres are very different between the sexes. Men are more likely than women to listen to health and living podcasts, 14% to 11%, not to mention true crime podcasts, and men are also much more likely to listen to podcasts on sport and business. Why has there been a shift away from the mainstream media to the world of podcasts? There are multiple reasons, but I would focus on the increasing superficiality of mainstream media content and the flagrant ideological bias of far too much of it. The mainstream media trades on sound bites and fast, superficial interviews. Podcasts typically can range from 15 minutes to 3 hours or more in duration, taking deep dives into any topic you could imagine. Perhaps equally significant in general, the ideological slant of the mainstream media does not reflect the demographic reality among Australians, or for that matter, Americans. For example, the visual media in Australia, and particularly, it has to be said, the ABC, was overwhelmingly in favour of The Voice. The ABC is an institution which really should be so professional that I ought not to know its views on anything. Yet in reality, I suspect I know its views on almost everything. The Voice proposal, for example, was overwhelmingly defeated by Australians, with a fraction over 60% saying no. In other words, the message coming from the mainstream media was completely at odds with how most Australians thought and felt. According to our in-house analysis at John Anderson Media, our videos and interviews on The Voice, which questioned the mainstream media, were the third most watched videos on the issue during the campaign period, in fact, well ahead of the ABC. Much of the same mainstream media bias characterised the recent US election, in contrast to the way people actually voted. In other words, there's a disconnect between the mainstream media and real people. If The Voice is one example, looking back, I wonder if the approach to renewables will be another case where the mainstream media ends up being clearly at odds with the people who are increasingly now better informed by fact-based analysis from non-mainstream media sources, such as the Centre for Independent Studies. Time will tell, but if I were in the mainstream media, I would be asking this hard question. Speaking personally, as many will know, I'm an Australian podcaster with a YouTube subscription base of close to 700,000 subscribers. We've now achieved over 230 million content views. While the ABC generally was interviewing people hostile to Donald Trump in the lead up and aftermath of the last US election, meaning that Australians have great trouble interpreting why the American people voted the way they did, and increasingly encouraging them to think, oh, stupid Americans, instead of saying they're not stupid, like Australians. Voters are intelligent. They were plainly thinking deeply about this. They've made a choice that affects us all. How do we understand it? So to that end, I interviewed Victor Davis Hanson, who's an esteemed American historian and author of The Case for Donald Trump. As of now, that interview has almost 3.5 million views. What was the most liked comment in the comments section? This is very revealing. The comment was, quote, "This 71-minute video is more educational than 10 straight years of watching mainstream media." Many in the mainstream media need to display sufficient humility, I would suggest, to reflect on their professionalism at a time when they are losing audiences hand over fist. Now, Australians aren't as passionate about their politics as Americans, so I'm not sure whether there will be a Joe Rogan moment in Australian politics that impacts an election, for example, the upcoming federal election. However, there are certainly obvious lessons for the mainstream media. Don't underestimate your audience's desire for deep analysis and viewpoint diversity. Stop thinking you can fool people that ideologically biased news is neutral. They see straight through it. As recent history has shown with the Voice referendum and the US election, the new media is here to stay. Long may it be a force to be reckoned with. Long may it give people quality information so that they can make informed decisions, notwithstanding the fact that, as we all know, there are irresponsible people online, just as there are people seeking to advance real knowledge and high quality content.